Right, morning all. So I'm Alex Craven. I'm Chief Executive Co-founder of the Data City. I've got Mo from the CBI with me. We'll do sort of a bit more of an introduction in a second. Thank you for joining today's seminar, where we're going to talk about the road to net zero, the national, regional and sector impacts of net zero. So this is on the back of quite a substantial piece of work that Data City and CBI Economics have partnered on. Looking at the net zero ecosystem and range of sort of wider data points and sort of policy context to try and provide insights. And we've got some really useful stuff in here, such as the local authority scorecards, which aims to provide a useful tool for local authorities in the context of assessing the potential impacts of this, of our net zero obligations. So in terms of agenda, we'll talk briefly about ourselves and the net zero sort of context that this sits. We're then going to talk about the methodology. We're going to by doing a live machine learning demonstration of the platform, finding companies that are working in the net zero sector. And then Mo's going to drive the rest of the agenda pretty much through the national, sectoral and regional analysis, which goes beyond the Data City's data to a broader context, and talk about what we think is coming next. There's an opportunity for Q&A. I mean, I'm fairly sort of relaxed about whether we save it all to the end or whether we answer questions as we go. Do you have any preference, Mo?
Happy just to take them as we go. If people have questions, pop them in the Q&A chat, and we'll just take them as we go.
Yeah, so feel free to fire those through as we run, and we'll do our best to pick them up, depending on who's speaking at the time, and then we'll go from there. Okay, righty. So I'm gonna pretty much covered it. So the sort of origin story of the Data City was on the back of TechNation's first report into the digital sector in 2014. At the time, I was running a top 100 digital agency, and the report was a list of all the digital agencies in the UK, and my business wasn't in it. And when I looked at the report, nor were about 3 out of 4 of the companies I would have expected to find, including some of the world's largest digital agencies headquartered in London. And that led me into this journey of discovery about how we identify sectors in the UK using the SIC code system, and where sectors didn't have an SIC code, as the system hasn't been updated since 2007, the limitations of that methodology for finding new emerging sectors. And by 2014, digital was not probably even a new or emerging sector. It had emerged. So we thought, using some tech that we were building in another context for marketing and marketing MarTech analysis of company websites, and through a conversation with one of my co-founders, Paul Connell, who works what was then the Open Data Institute node in Leeds, we could probably use a different approach using website text to describe what companies do and find better representation of a sector. So that's what I'm going to show you, the evolution of that idea into what is now a business called the Data City. Over to you, Mo.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, my name's Mo. I am head of economic projects within CBI Economics. So I'm not going to do an origin story of the CBI, but maybe just for CBI Economics, given that we've been around for about 2.5 years. We're basically the economic consultancy division of the CBI. So a couple of years ago, we were getting a lot of interest to provide consulting services to our members. For those of you who don't know what the CBI is, we are the Confederation of British Industry. So we represent businesses to improve the business environment in the UK and to government as well. We represent about 1/3 of the private workforce. And so we were getting these demands, and about 2.5 years ago, genuinely, like literally at the start of the pandemic, we decided to start this business of doing economic consulting, and it's done fairly well to date. And I think, I'm not quite sure how we met, Alex. It must have been through an introduction, but yeah, we did this piece of work with the Data City a bit earlier in the year, and as Alex said, it's fairly significant. And we wanted to show, as how we could go beyond the standard industrial classification codes, and wanted to also then be able to do some economic modelling at the end of it. That was sort of our value add. and just to see whether that would work, and it did. And and the full set of results you can see, we'll have got a link to access the report at the end of the deck as well. But that's sort of an introduction and about the CBI Economics business. Shall I just jump into? Yes, there we go. Thanks, Alex. Just before we get into sort of the details and the results, I thought it's always good to talk a little bit about sort of why net zero, and just to do a bit of a scene setting piece here. And the reason we wanted to get into exploring net zero is partly because of the, as we all know, scientific evidence of climate change, fairly well documented. The UK was the first country to actually enshrine in law a target to achieve net zero by 2050. Was sort of the first country in the world, first major economy in the world to do that. And there's been increasingly the impacts of climate change have been increasingly implemented into economic models. 2 examples here around just what the impact is if we don't take action, and the lost GDP as a result of sort of different scenarios. We have Swiss Re in the first example saying it could be between 3.1% and 8.7% lost to GDP, and then the Stern Review also looking at between 5 and 20% of global GDP, both huge numbers. So this cost of inaction combined with the opportunities of action means that the transition to net zero is really going to be the growth story of at least this decade, if not the next couple of decades. And that will lead to structural shifts both in the economy and in society. The impact of the transition will be quite far-reaching, as it will impact household spending patterns. And as a result of investment into low-tech products and services, it could also be it could serve as a massive potential for growth for businesses there as well. So it really affects everyone. And I guess most of us are sort of seeing the impact of, say, higher energy prices and behavioural changes there that we're all taking, including myself, of sort of refusing to switch the boiler on while my wife complains bitterly that it's time to do that. So that's why sort of net zero sectors we were really interested in looking at. The other reason was really when we started to look at net zero, we found that as an emerging industry, there really wasn't that much data for which businesses and local authorities could use to make investment decisions. And that's really where the story began in terms of this piece of work. So that's what we always needed, that data and evidence just to understand the scale, to get to grips with it. And it exists in many other industries, but not in net zero ecosystem. It's really important for sort of businesses working towards net zero or supporting the supply chain. And I'll add just this before I sort of pass back to Alex, is we had a lot of conversations within the CBI and with our members to help crystallize, and that really helped to crystallize this the need for this data. And we just realized that we didn't know enough about the sector to be able to really say much about it. So that's where we had this idea with Alex and the guys at Data City to dig into the data and look into it in a bit more detail. At the time, we actually didn't know what that would look like. And so we set about collecting the data first, and then the approach that Alex is going to sort of talk a little bit about now neatly demonstrated that we could come up with a good narrative and a story once we'd gone over that data. So I think I'll pass to Alex now to talk about the methodology, and then come back to talking about some of the findings after.
Thank you very much, Mo. So our job in this was to try to find the net zero sector as it stands at the moment. So that process involved a lot of sort of research, speaking to experts in the industry to identify what became 16 sort of sector verticals. So this is an attempt to sort of map it as an ecosystem. There's a sort of focus on trying to understand it in the context of supply chain dynamics, but it isn't a strict supply chain mapping because some of the definitions and taxonomies sort of defy that sort of rigidity. The approach we take is to use the website text of companies to understand what they do, and then use machine learning to do essentially a huge amount of legwork that would otherwise be people using Google to try and find more companies that do the same thing. So the way it works is to research the sector, define your verticals, identify good examples of companies within those verticals and use them as a training set for a machine learning classifier. and then let the machine learning classifier score all of the websites in the UK and find all the companies that look like the training set you provided it. And I'm going to show you an example of that in a second. So there's just shy of 18,000 companies is the sort of output of this data across 16 ecosystem verticals. You can access that in the platform, and part of the benefit of our approach is that as those sectors evolve, and it's a quirk of new and emerging sectors, is that often their own language changes. So they will describe what they do in different terms over time. The beauty of using machine learning is as they update their websites, the classifier is updated by their websites. So the ability to track and follow the sector is sort of built into the methodology. So what we're hoping is that this is a sort of baselining exercise, but we can now, having understood the baseline of the sector, track its emergence, and we combine all sorts of other data sources and so on to provide additional insight into that. So without further ado, I'm going to try and show you this in anger. So I'm going to pick quite a specific niche within agritech, just as one example. So this is our platform. You can see I've been playing with ones I built earlier in case anything goes wrong. But if we wanted to create, in this case, I'm going to do vertical farming. Call it vertical farming live. First thing we need to do is find examples of the sector. So I'm going to use our platform a bit like Google. So what we've got is all UK companies in here, and we've matched about 1.6 million of them to their website. So there are about 5 million active companies. There's about, we think maybe 1.8 million have actual websites. The rest, there's a lot of sort of multiple companies at one website address because they are property shells or group structure entities. So what the platform will do is it will give me the top 50 websites or companies by how relevant it thinks their websites are to the search query. So we can have a look at these and find good examples of the vertical farming sector. So for the purpose of the demo, I'm not going to do particularly detailed analysis of these, but what we need to do is make sure that we are satisfied this is a good training set example. And we add that to a machine learning classifier and it appears here. So we would repeat that process for a few more. So these are some of the organizations that I've looked at previously. So I know these are good examples of the sector. So we'll add these, and we just need a few to get things going, but the more you give it, the more rich an understanding of the sectoral language the machine learning classifier obtains. But I'll crack on with these 4 examples. So what it's now doing is it's analyzing the language of those websites, looking for common patterns of language between them, and then it's ranking 1.6 million websites live. And then it returns that 1.6 million sorted by how relevant to the classifier to lowest. So we have the most relevant at the top. So that's one of the ones in the training set, but you've got other ones here. What I need to do now for machine learning is it's as important to provide examples of what you're not looking for, so it can understand and remove those companies from the sector. So I'm going to go to the bottom of the list, the least well matched. And I'm going to add these as negatives. So we've got carpets and flooring, and I'll just quickly whiz through these. Estate agent. And then we'll rebuild the list. So you can see we're now down to 688 companies. What we can do is then do things like show me, I'm going to use so this will show me all the companies with the phrase vertical farm and ing or without ing in the data that it's got so far. And hit update. So all of these companies have mentioned the vertical farming key phrase. So I'm going to add some more of these to the training set.
Alex, sorry, you just missed adding that as a keyword.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So close.
Yeah. Here we go. There we go. So these are all good examples of the sector. And you get the idea. We can now rebuild this sector, and what the machine learning classifier is doing is it's learning, it's not storing the key phrases that I've been using, it's learning patterns of language from the training set. So it has identified farming, vertical farming, food growing. These are the things which it's starting to rank. And as we go through this training set, we get an ever more refined picture of the sector. You can then access all sorts of information on these, such as contact details, financials. We've also got a partnership with an organisation called Deal Room, which shows equity investment, and we've also got grant data in here. So we're able to provide a view of this as sort of insights, which shows, in this case, I've only got 62 companies so far, but total investment they've raised, so 94 million, total Innovate UK grant funding, over 3 million, which shows the sort of inward investment profile for it. We've got the clustering, and we can do things like view the growth of the sector over time. If I scroll down, got jobs and skills data here from Lightcast, and growth of the sector. So this is encouraging, obviously, for our economic outlook. And from here, we can work out how to support this sector, and then we can track the impact of this and start to answer questions like, does the UK actually have the net zero sector it needs in order to answer its net zero targets? Okay, so I think that's probably enough from me. I will hand back to Mo.
Thanks, Alex. That was you're a lot quicker at that than I am anyway, to build some of these. So I mean, look, you've just seen how these sectors are built, and we took the 16 sort of verticals as Alex mentioned in the net zero ecosystem. They ranged everything from agri-tech through to green consulting, all the way through to energy construction and so on. And what we wanted to do is, at the time, there were 16,000 businesses when we did the analysis. I think Alex mentioned there were 18,000 now, so you can see how quickly this area is growing and the algorithm is learning. We found from our analysis, we took that data and we ran it through our own economic model. We found that those 16,000 businesses are contributing about £60 billion to the UK economy each year. And the way that works is, as Alex mentioned, the Data City connects businesses' websites to their company's house records, and we saw that in total, across the ecosystem, those businesses had about £200 billion of turnover. And by feeding that, as I said, into our in-house economic model, we see that those businesses contribute about 60 billion. That represents about 3.3% of the UK economy as a whole each year. So it's quite significant. And we also found from looking at jobs numbers that that supports 766,000 full-time equivalent jobs, so about 2.8% of total employment in the UK. The outdated official sector classifications risk hampering some of this decarbonisation effort and fails to show the full extent of growth in this sector. And that's, I think, again, as I go back to why we did this, that's the key reason why we did this, is we didn't find any data that even came close to finding the number of businesses that we were able to find through this exercise. And having found this data and it provided us with the foundations that we needed to then build out our economic model further and our economic modelling further as well. So once we had this, we used our modelling to then look at not just the economic impact of these businesses by themselves, but then also to do a bit more of a deep dive on these businesses that they bring and their supply chains and other impacts that they have. And that's what you can see on the right hand side of this slide, is the sort of gross value add and the employment contributions that are created using input-output modeling. So gross value add is just how much value a business adds as a product or service is being developed. So if a business takes raw materials and converts it to an intermediate product, that process is the value add that they create. And that's just a national accounts sort of term in trying to capture the value that those businesses add. So that's why we talk about 60 billion contribution to the economy, even though they have sort of 200 billion turnover. And the way that we split this out, and the reason I sort of talk about input-output modeling, is because input-output modeling is basically the established way of looking at economic impact using this approach. So it's something that the ONS publishes, the Office for National Statistics, and we're then able to say within the 3.3% contribution that these businesses have, 1.2% of that is just the activity that of these businesses themselves. 0.6% of that is the supply chain that they help to support. 0.6% of that, again, like another 0.6% is the wider supply chain. So it could be the supply chain of the businesses within the supply chain. And then the final bit at the very top is the induced impact in blue, and that is the spending that's generated by employees of the businesses in the supply chain. So when we talk about all of that, that's the full impact these businesses have, and that's quite extensive in terms of what we're able to look at. And that's the beauty of this approach. So for typical analysis, we take ONS sector classifications and run those through our model. These are existing classifications, as Alex said, they haven't been updated since 2007, but that's what most economists work with. Here, we were able to take sort of totally new classifications and calculate the impact that they have using existing methodologies. And the way we did that is because the data that we had from the Data City links businesses to Companies House records. When you sign up for a new business on Companies House, you have to put down what sector you're in using the old system. And so from there, we're able to link these new classifications, map them to the old sector classifications, and then do the economic value analysis. So it's a bit of a convoluted process, but the proof is here that it works. In terms of, I think if we're able to go to the next slide, I think. Brilliant, thank you. Then in terms of like looking at opportunities for businesses to invest, the idea of this research was to be a bit of a landscape piece as well, to look at what opportunities there are in the sector. So business investment in the UK actually performs quite poorly when you look at the G7, like the 7 largest economies in the world. And it's actually been below G7 average since the 1990s. And then in recent years, and as you all know, because of leaving the EU and as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, this has further reduced sort of demand for businesses to invest. But we know that business investment is a key part of solving this net zero puzzle. We need 1.4 trillion investment between now and 2050 to reach net zero businesses. And again, as Alex mentioned, because of the deal that they have and the data that they have from the deal room, the Data City were able to provide us with the insights here to show that there's been this tremendous growth in investment within the net zero ecosystem that we're tracking. And as you can see from this chart on the right hand side, sort of the figures just absolutely explode in the last sort of 3 years. And that's because of the funding, the private sort of equity funding that these businesses have received. In 2021, it reached just over $1 billion, it was 1.1 billion. And the other thing that we know is that that if you don't invest in net zero and achieving net zero, whether you are a business transitioning or a new business that is net zero, it's the risk of being left behind and risk of not benefiting from like learning by doing and those network effects or economies of scale. And you could end up with, in particular, in say oil and gas or other sectors, you could end up with stranded assets where your asset is no longer worth even maintaining because it's lost its value. And the other thing is, we know if you don't invest, for projections that are made, like the cost of clean energy, they've fallen much more quickly than any projection that any business, any organization has made. So it really is, we want to illustrate the benefits of investing in net zero as well. And then the other thing that we found, and again, this is something that was a bit of a surprise to us, as I said, when we looked at the data, is that there were these on average in the net zero ecosystem, wages were higher than compared with many traditional sectors. So we know that there's going to be this significant redistribution from high carbon to low carbon jobs. And our literature review showed that these low carbon jobs would typically require a bit of retraining, some higher qualifications, and they're much more in demand at the moment as well. And we actually found, again, as this sort of exhibit 3 shows the chart, that on average, wages in the net zero ecosystem are higher than many other traditional sectors. So we've got the net zero ecosystem in orange here, and you can see the other sectors there. On average, it's about £37,160, which when you look at national average wages, is quite significantly higher than that. So again, just like I said, we looked at the data and came up with a narrative. This was a really sort of powerful message that we wanted to get across in the report as well. After this, we did the sector analysis, and what we did is, of these 16 verticals that we had presented earlier, we looked at sort of what was the largest subsector or vertical, and we wanted to understand that in a bit more detail. And probably not surprising to many of you here, it was renewable energies being the sort of largest portion of the 16 verticals. It supports around 170,000 jobs, or has 170,000 employees, and about 7,000 of those 16,000 businesses that we found. So that's about 40% of total employees and 45% of the businesses that we mapped. So huge in terms of the 16 sectors that we looked at. Waste management and recycling also formed one of the largest, with 94,000 employees that we've got here and 3,100 businesses. But we see that venture funding in this area is much lower. So on the other hand, what you would expect for venture funding in is typically like the sort of the sectors that come to mind when you think about net zero is really like electric vehicles, renewable energy. Those had by far the largest inflow of funding. And then businesses like, or sectors like waste management, recycling had much lower funding into that. And there can be multiple reasons for that. You know, like EVs, for example, are very new technologies. You need more money to help make breakthroughs, whereas waste management and recycling is a bit more established. Might not be that it needs as much funding, or it could just be their relative attractiveness as well. So I think some of these results are probably intuitive to many people when they see them. Just because of like the amount you read about sort of EVs and renewable energy startups and other activities there, but it's still good to have the data to actually back that up. I think that's quite interesting. Then I think if we just go into looking at the economic contribution of key sectors, so because of the way the data was set up, we were then able to go into much further detail on some of these verticals, on these subsectors, and we go into a bit more detail in the report. But I just wanted to highlight the sort of 3 highest sectors that we had in terms of economic contribution. One of which is energy, and the other is construction. These were 9 and 8.3 billion respectively of the total 60 billion that we had. And the way that we've done these charts is we show sort of the initial impact, and as I said, the initial is just what that business does, and then the total impact, both on employment and for gross value add. So you can see the multiplier effect that these businesses have across the economy. I think the one to note is waste management is a bit more insulated than the wider economy. Its supply chains are shorter compared with something like construction, which is more labor intensive and leads to a much larger multiplier effect. And that's just because of if you think about construction, the sectors that it draws on for construction to work. So again, makes sense sort of intuitively when you think those things, think those things through. And just as an aside, I've sort of been asked this question before, and I thought I'd just answer it rather than it sort of popping up in the QA. On something like energy, I think we mentioned that we have businesses like EDF and E.ON and the like in there. One of the these businesses have like gas turbines, they have fossil fuel technology, as well as renewable parts of their business as well. The thing that we haven't been able to do yet is to split those two out and look at the impact that the net zero ecosystem has purely by itself. And that's something we may look at for next year's iteration of the report. But at the moment, it captures those businesses as a whole. And it might be that if you look through their accounts, you might be able to dig into that and separate that out. But it's one of the things that we're working on at the moment. So I thought I'd just mention that because we know that a lot of these businesses have like huge sort of wind farms as well as existing sort of gas turbines as well. If I just talk about regional analysis briefly, because I think this is probably one of the most interesting parts of the analysis that we did on the net zero transition, and something that is a little bit unexpected actually. We found that the regions that sees the growth opportunities of net zero benefit from higher paying jobs, as we showed, because of the wage premium for net zero related jobs. We've also seen that the growth in manufacturing in, say, electric vehicles can bring a massive boost to regional manufacturing hubs. We've seen that in places like Sunderland, Swindon, Solihull. And what we've also found when we did this research, and hopefully the heat maps show this as well, is that the North, the Midlands and Scotland have more net zero businesses, and there's much less concentration of these businesses in London. And that's what these two charts on the right are showing in terms of the variety or varying levels of distribution. The darker areas are where you have a higher concentration of businesses in the net zero ecosystem in the top right, and then the sort of bottom is actually showing distribution of businesses on business count, just to give you a flavor of the difference. And that's where you see the concentration in London of many businesses. And I should say that this is all despite a lot of net zero businesses typically being registered in London as well. So, despite that, you still see this picture of businesses having a lot of activity outside of sort of London and the southeast, which I think is a great, in I guess old government speak, we talked about levelling up. It's a great story to tell there in terms of levelling up. And what we did here, just focusing on the distribution, is we then looked at the economic distribution of the net zero system at a more local level, and we see that after you adjust for each region's size, the net zero ecosystem has a similar share of regional activity across the UK. It's about 3%. And in fact, the only outlier where the share of net zero activity is lower, or one of the areas where it's lowest, is London, which is 2.3%. So again, it's just funny. It's just kind of interesting how it's a little bit flipped on its head when you look at the net zero ecosystem. What we did, as I said, we looked at sort of local level. We wanted to go a bit further in being able to visualize this redistribution across the regions. And we know that there are still large disparities at local levels. So this all coincides with research that we've seen that shows inequalities between local authorities can be quite strong even within a region, and they can be more acute than when you look at distributions between two larger regions. So just to be able to explore that in a bit more detail, we built these net zero scorecards, which again you can access through this link, and I think we'll be sharing the slides, where they're free to access for authorities across the country. And what they show is we came up with 8 metrics that we wanted to look at in a bit more detail across energy, economy, and emissions. And they provide this snapshot of the transition of these 374 local authorities across the UK. This red, amber, green system that we've used is just to summarize how each local authority is performing, and to determine on each metric whether they sit in the bottom 25%, in the middle 50%, or in the top 25%. And obviously the top 25% receive a green rating, and then sort of amber, and then red. And as I said, freely available. You can go have a look in sort of PDF format. And you can see actually, just very, very briefly, if for those of you who are a bit more sort of politically aware of where constituents and MPs are, the ones that have performed more poorly were in the previous cabinet, weirdly enough, like sort of Rishi Sunak's constituency and others. It's just, I mean, a lot of this comes back to their historical trends and other factors, but it was really just to give an idea to local authorities of where they sit, so they can sort of see some of these opportunities before it's too late. And then you can see some of these other local authorities a bit more sort of on the places that you might not expect, but some of them are like coastal towns and cities where, because of wind farms or other net zero activities, they've been able to perform much better on some of these metrics. Now, I think just on the just before sort of wrap up, wanted to just talk about what we are planning on doing and how we want to use this methodology going forward. So we released this report in July, and there are two things really. One is that the methodology we can reuse to look at other sectors, but also we want to be able to continue telling the story for the net zero system. So we're thinking at the moment, already looking ahead, given that, as Alex said, there's like 2,000 increase in businesses just in this sector since we did this analysis earlier in the year. We want to do a refresh of this report next year to look at the story and how that's changed, looking ahead. But we also want to look at other emerging sectors, and we've got a few listed here, which partly just because of interest that we've had internally, like the air quality ecosystem, given that air quality is the next big thing when it comes to looking at sort of climate change. Sharing economy, you know, the likes of, say, like car sharing, you rent out a room in your house, that kind of thing is just not captured at all in national accounts. It's really difficult to capture that as well. And things like fintech, which we all have sort of grown to know and love. Again, not much data out there on the scale of fintech in the UK, the size of those economies. So we want to be able to use this methodology to look at other sectors as well. And if you have any suggestions, please do include them in the chat, in the Q&A. And then just to say that we've also then looked at how we can apply this to specific businesses. So we're currently working with 2 businesses to look at where they fit. So one is a waste energy generation business, and one's a sort of multinational energy company. And they're both interested in looking at where they fit in within that 60 billion, what they contribute, and what opportunities there are for them to get more involved and to have a look at the supply chain in a bit more detail. So it really is on a business level, on like a local authority level, as well as on a whole level as well. And we're looking at extending the methodology to look at environmental impacts, things like, as well as the economic impacts. So things like emissions, water usage, waste production, because that is what a lot of businesses are telling us they're focusing on more now. And that's, again, something that they would want to know the economic impact and where they fit in, but they also want to know then what their impacts are, what their footprint looks like across some of these metrics. So yeah, that's I think everything to sort of cover. I think we've got our sort of scan the QR codes. They have our details, and you can check out our websites. And at this point, I think I'm going to pass back to Alex. I think, Alex, you had a question you wanted to pose to the group as well, didn't you?
Yeah, I do. So Clive's asked a few questions in the Q&A. So I've answered one of them, but he's answered a couple more here. So is energy storage included or assessed, e.g. hydro pump and compressed air storage? They play a valuable role in net zero journey. Do you know?
Good question. So I actually think they are. I think the way that we have set up the 16 verticals, I think one of them does actually capture energy stored, and yeah, so I think it does capture those. I don't think they're a huge part of the UK's energy mix, but they are certainly captured within one of the verticals. On smart metering, I have to be honest, when we looked at the data, I couldn't tell you. It may be that they are, and I haven't seen them. So that's one that we probably have to come back to you on.
Cool. Does anybody else want to pose any questions? Oh, we've got a few more coming in. So the report is 999. So the report, the scorecards are free. So first of all, you can look at your local authority scorecard. I don't know what else to say apart from that. We thought it was very reasonable, and it could be have a huge impact for a local authority. I suppose the other way you might want to think about it, perhaps, and we do get a lot of interest, is at combined authority or LEP level, and that might make it more accessible, perhaps. Hope that helps. Any more questions from the? What we do yet? So yeah, Paul's answering Clive's question here, and then Pooja. Sorry. So I think this might be for you, Mo.
Good. Yeah, that's a really good question, Pooja. So yes, it absolutely captures things that are tangible, like GVA and jobs. I think on intangible gains, so this is an area that we do work in, looking at societal impacts of businesses, and sort of things around like social democracy, etc. That's usually actually just done through a survey-based approach. So the way that would work is, if we were wanting to capture some of those impacts, we would take, we would survey those businesses of what are you doing on social value, on the environment, on your environmental impacts, to be able to collect that. And there are models that do look at that, but you really just need that data. That data is really not available through any means or any sources unless you survey businesses. So that's the way that we would look at, and that's the way we have previously looked at social value before, to look at the sort of those intangible gains of the impact that these businesses have on through the channels that you've talked about. So it's a really good question. I wish we could sort of do more on that, but we are sort of a little bit constrained by having to use survey-based methods to collect that data.
And then I'll probably take this one for Benjamin's asked a question about companies based in London but operating in other locations. So we take data from a number of data providers, and obviously we're taking information from company websites. So what we try to do is capture all of the trading locations of the businesses in the data set and show those. So we have the registered address as supplied by company's house, but we also take data files from a company called Reddit Safe and also another company called Red Flag. And then we also look on the contact pages for trading locations and try to add all those locations to our understanding of the company. That answers it. Any more questions from the audience? So the question I had was, obviously we've had the mini budget announcement, which has a focus on the concept of these new enterprise zones. And the thought that popped into my head was whether there's an opportunity here to make these, certainly in the regions, for all the data we've just seen from Mo, to link the concept of net zero to the enterprise zone schemes, and whether that was something we thought might be of interest to local authorities and businesses inside and outside of London. So I don't know if you had any thoughts, Mo.
Good question. I think depending on how these are implemented, I think there is definitely potential there. I mean, it's still, all of this is still new, and as probably all of you have seen, the markets are still digesting the impact of some of these announcements. I think it will just depend on the detail, as always, but using this platform in particular, given how you're able to look at, in particular, regional constituency-based geographical locations, I think there's definitely potential for some local authorities or mayoral combined authorities to set up some of these zones and just focus on net zero and parts of the net zero ecosystem as we've set out. I think there's real potential there. But the proof is just, I guess once we get the detail and how that would work and what that would look like, and playing to some of those region strengths as well. And I think, again, that's why this sort of analysis is important, to show where different subsectors are based across the country, and allowing those local authorities, or those, as you said, like LEPs or mayoral combined authorities, to first is always just understanding what strengths you have, what clusters you have in your region, I think.
Great, thanks, Mo. Are there any more questions? So hopefully you're able to use the QR code if you're so minded, or follow the links from this screen. Mo and my email addresses are here if you want to send us a direct email. You can, of course, get in touch via our websites as well. If there's nothing else, I think we're probably good to wrap up. A little bit ahead of time. We'll be sending out copies of the presentation and the actual video of the webinar to everyone who registered. And if you think you want to share that on, please do. I think that's all from me. Thanks very much for everybody for coming.
Thank you.
Okay.